The Whispering Waters. The road into Greymark village wound through a forest that felt older than memory itself. Trees so tall their branches seemed to scrape the clouds, roots so gnarled they resembled bones pushing up through the earth. Daniel Cross had driven for hours, chasing the faint lines on an old, half-burned map that he had purchased from a traveler who swore he had once seen something, not meant for human eyes, hidden deep within the woods. Daniel was a travel photographer, but not one content with landscapes and postcard-perfect shots. He was a collector of forgotten legends, a seeker of places the world tried to bury in silence. His blog, Wandering Beyond Maps, had begun as a hobby, but now it was his obsession. Every month, he sought new ground, chasing whispers of haunted valleys, ruined asylums, nameless graveyards. But nothing stirred his curiosity more than the story he had heard in the tavern 2 nights ago, spoken in hushed tones by men who drank to forget. They had mentioned a lake, a black lake, so still it looked like polished stone, where no wind ever touched the surface, where the air always smelled faintly of rot, and where, once you heard your name carried across the water, there was no escape. They called it Black Hollow Lake, and the way their eyes darted nervously at the mere mention of it was what convinced Daniel it was real. Fear like that wasn't faked. As he drove into Greymark, the village looked like a place abandoned by time. The houses were wooden, sagging under decades of storms, their shutters nailed closed, their windows covered with heavy cloth as if the residents were forever trying to keep something out, or in. The cobblestone streets were cracked, and though it was only early evening, the place already seemed to be tucking itself in for the night. Lamps flickered weakly against the growing shadows, and the few villagers Daniel passed lowered their heads, muttering quietly as though afraid their words might be overheard by something lurking nearby. Daniel parked near a sagging inn whose sign, "The Weary Stag," creaked in the wind. The moment he stepped inside, conversation died. The inn smelled of wood smoke and damp earth, and every eye turned to him, measuring, cautious, as though deciding if he was another fool who would be swallowed by the lake. Daniel ordered a meal and a drink, and when he mentioned he was searching for Black Hollow Lake, the innkeeper, a broad man with sorrow carved into his face, slammed the mug down hard enough to splash ale onto the counter. "You don't want to go there," he said flatly. His voice carried the weight of finality, but Daniel only leaned forward, notebook ready. "I'm not here to swim," Daniel assured him, "just to see it. To take photographs, record the stories. I write about places like this, places the world's forgotten." A murmur rose among the patrons. Some shook their heads. An old woman by the fire spat into the ash, muttering, "He won't be writing much longer." One of the younger men, face pale as chalk, leaned forward. "If you hear it call your name," he whispered, "don't answer. Don't even breathe. Just run. Do you hear me? Run." Daniel tried to press for details, but the innkeeper cut him off. "No more talk," he barked. "Some things are better left unsaid." Yet later that night, as Daniel prepared to head to his rented room upstairs, the same man who had whispered to him slipped him a folded scrap of parchment. It was a crude sketch, a path through the woods, ending at a blot of ink shaped like a teardrop. "The hollow," the man said quietly. "But you didn't get this from me." The next morning, Daniel followed the path. The deeper he went into the forest, the quieter it became. Birds no longer sang, no insects buzzed. The air itself felt heavy, pressing down like a damp shroud. Hours passed, and then, suddenly, the trees parted. He stopped dead in his tracks. There it was. Black Hollow Lake stretched before him, wider than he had imagined, a sheet of perfect stillness that mirrored the sky with unnerving clarity. The water was not blue, not green, but black, like endless polished obsidian. It reflected so flawlessly that Daniel's eyes grew confused. He felt he could fall upward into the sky if he stared too long. No breeze stirred the surface. No fish broke through. The lake was silent, too silent. The only sound was his own breath and the pounding of his heart. Setting up his camera, Daniel crouched near the edge, aiming for the perfect shot. That was when he heard it. At first, he thought it was the wind, though the air was perfectly still. Then he thought it was the water shifting, though the surface remained glass. And then the sound grew sharper, undeniable, a voice. It was his name, Daniel. He jerked upright, camera nearly slipping from his hands. The voice had come from across the lake, soft, beckoning. He stared, searching, but there was no one there. Just endless trees and shadow. His throat tightened. He shook his head, whispering to himself, "You're tired. It's the forest playing tricks." He turned back to his equipment. But then the voice came again. Daniel. This time, his blood ran cold. Because it wasn't just any voice. It was his mother's. Daniel froze. His mother had been dead for 10 years. She had passed quietly, in her sleep, but the sound of her voice had never left him. He would have known it anywhere. Now it was calling to him, carried across black waters that should not have carried sound at all. He stumbled back from the edge, breath ragged, eyes darting wildly. "This isn't real," he muttered. "It's just the mind, just the silence getting to you." But the lake seemed to shimmer as though mocking him, its reflection bending, twisting. And then, faintly, he thought he saw movement beneath the surface, just the barest ripple of pale shapes turning slowly in the blackness. The whispers continued until night fell. Daniel built a small fire near the shore, notebook open in his lap, hands trembling as he wrote down every detail, the stillness, the reflection, the voice. He told himself he wasn't afraid. He was documenting, observing, investigating like always. But the truth was, he had never felt such dread seep into his bones before. The fire crackled, throwing shadows across the trees, and the lake lay silent. Yet when the moon rose, its silver light painted the surface so perfectly that Daniel felt he was staring into another world entirely, a mirror world, waiting just below. And then the voice came again, clearer than ever. Daniel. This time, it wasn't just his mother. There were others. Dozens of voices rising in a whispering chorus, some calling his name, others weeping, others laughing softly as though mocking him. Daniel pressed his hands to his ears, but it was inside his skull, rattling, pulling. The air turned cold. His fire sputtered, and when he looked back at the lake, his own reflection was smiling at him. The reflection. Daniel didn't sleep that night. How could he, with the whispers never ceasing, rising and falling like some tide that didn't belong to water? They called to him through the firelight, names he didn't know and names he did, voices of strangers and voices he thought buried deep in his past, his childhood friend who had drowned in a river when Daniel was 12, his grandmother who had died before he was born yet whose voice he somehow knew, and above all, his mother, calm and tender, as if coaxing him home after a long day. He pressed his palms against his ears until they ached, but the sound came from beneath the skin, vibrating in his bones, threading into the core of his being. When dawn finally came, it brought no comfort, only a pale light that turned the black water into something worse, because now he could see shapes beneath it, fleeting and pale, drifting just below the surface, their movements too deliberate to be tricks of the eye. They looked like hands sometimes, other times like faces pressed against the glass of another world, straining upward. He packed his things, or tried to. Every motion felt heavy, sluggish, as though the lake itself wanted him to stay. His camera was still set up on its tripod from the day before, and when he checked it, he found that during the night it had captured dozens of images on its own, though he had never touched the shutter. He clicked through them with trembling fingers. At first they were only of the lake, black and endless, but then the angles began to change, as if someone, or something, had moved the lens. One showed a close-up of his sleeping bag where he should have been lying, though he was certain he had not slept. Another showed the fire sputtering low, but in the corner of the frame, there was something pale, almost human-shaped, crouched near the water. And then the last photo, time-stamped just before dawn, made his stomach twist into ice. It was his reflection, standing at the water's edge, smiling directly at the camera, even though he had been behind the lens. His throat tightened. The image was wrong. The reflection was Daniel, but not. The smile stretched too wide, the eyes too dark, too knowing. And in the photo, the reflection's hand was raised in a wave, as if greeting whoever found the picture. Daniel's breath came short, quick, and for the first time in years, he questioned why he ever chased these stories. This wasn't adventure. This was something older than fear itself, something that swallowed curiosity whole. He should have left then. He should have gathered his equipment, followed the forest path, returned to Greymark, written a safe version of the tale and never spoken of it again. But the lake did not let go. As he turned to leave, the whispers rose again, insistent, urgent. His mother's voice rose above them, soft and pleading, "Don't go, Daniel. Please, don't leave me here." His legs faltered, his chest constricted. Against his better judgment, against every instinct screaming at him, he stepped back toward the water. The surface mirrored him perfectly. Morning light revealed him in flawless clarity, except it wasn't flawless. As he leaned closer, the reflection lingered a second too long after he moved, as though it had forgotten how to mimic him. He lifted his right hand. The reflection's left lifted more slowly, lagging behind. He tilted his head. It tilted too far, the neck bending at an unnatural angle before snapping back upright. Then it smiled. His reflection smiled on its own, lips curling without his command. Daniel stumbled back, heart hammering. His boot splashed into the edge of the lake. The surface rippled, and when it stilled, the reflection had not returned to normal. Instead, it stood perfectly still, watching him, lips frozen in that grotesque grin. That night he built another fire, this time larger, feeding it constantly as though the flames alone could keep the voices at bay. But the whispers grew louder anyway, circling the camp like wolves, weaving through the crackle of the wood until he thought he might lose his mind. The lake gleamed silver under the moon, smooth as polished glass, and the reflection of the firelight danced unnaturally, flames twisting into shapes that resembled grasping hands. Daniel tried to distract himself by writing in his notebook, but when he looked down, the words he had scribbled hours before seemed different now, warped, as if rewritten by another hand. "Daniel, come home. Daniel, come home. Daniel, come home." The same sentence, scrawled dozens of times, filling pages he swore he hadn't touched. When he dared glance at the water, his reflection was gone. Not twisted, not smiling, simply gone. Only the forest reflected back at him, empty shore where he should have been standing. His stomach knotted with dread. He leaned closer, scanning, whispering to himself that it was just the angle, just a trick of light. But then, from the corner of his vision, movement. He spun, but the forest was still. When he turned back, his reflection had returned, standing closer now, as though it had stepped toward him while he wasn't looking. Its grin was wider, teeth too sharp, and for the first time he saw that its eyes weren't eyes at all but empty black pits that swallowed the firelight whole. That night, the footsteps began. Soft at first, barely audible over the wind that didn't exist, crunching leaves in a circle around his camp. Daniel sat frozen, clutching the handle of his pocket knife, breath shallow. He told himself it was an animal, a deer maybe, but the steps were too deliberate, too careful, like someone pacing just outside the fire's glow. Then, slowly, wet footprints appeared in the dirt. Bare, human, leading from the edge of the lake straight toward his camp. He followed them with horrified eyes until they stopped right behind his sleeping bag. His heart lurched into his throat. There was no one there. Only the prints, shining damp under the moonlight. He stumbled back, tripping over his gear, nearly falling into the fire. And when he scrambled to his feet, the prints had vanished, as though the earth had swallowed them whole. By dawn, Daniel was a wreck. His eyes were bloodshot, his notebook scattered with frenzied notes and sketches of faces half remembered from dreams he swore he hadn't had. He tried to tell himself he would leave. He even packed his bag, slinging his camera over his shoulder. But when he reached the tree line, the whispers rose again, louder, furious now, and his mother's voice broke through them, sobbing, begging, "Don't leave me, Daniel. Please, just one step closer, just come to me." His chest ached, his hands shook. He turned back, and the lake was waiting, black and endless, reflection perfectly still. The surface shimmered faintly, as though alive. He should have run. Instead, with trembling legs and eyes wide with terror and longing, Daniel walked back down the slope, every step heavier than the last, until his boots touched the shore once more. The voices fell silent, replaced by a stillness more suffocating than sound. He dropped his bag. His camera slipped from his shoulder, landing in the dirt. He stared at the reflection. This time, it did not mimic him at all. It only stood there, smiling, one hand raised in silent invitation. Daniel's lips parted. His breath came out in a shudder. And then, as if compelled by something far greater than his own will, Daniel stepped into the water. The reflection winked. The drowned. The lake swallowed him without a splash, the surface closing over Daniel's head as though it had never been broken, as though the water had always been waiting for him. Cold pierced every nerve, sharper than knives, sinking straight into his bones. He tried to scream, but his mouth filled with water that tasted of rust and earth, thick as though the lake carried centuries of rot within it. His arms thrashed, legs kicked, but the water was heavy, unnatural, pressing against him from all directions. It wasn't like sinking into a lake, it was like falling through liquid stone. Shapes stirred around him, pale outlines drifting in the darkness. Fingers brushed his skin, thin and skeletal, tugging at his clothes, pulling him deeper. He fought harder, lungs burning, but for every frantic stroke upward, something unseen dragged him farther down. The surface, the light of the moon above, dimmed, shrinking to a faint shimmer he could never reach. And then he saw them. Faces in the dark, dozens, hundreds, suspended like grotesque lanterns beneath the water. Their eyes glowed faintly, milky white, their mouths opening and closing in silent screams that turned into whispers against his skull. He recognized some of them, the boy from his childhood who had drowned in the river, his grandmother whom he had never met, the strangers from the photos and stories, but there were countless others, men and women, young and old, faces twisted in anguish, eyes wide with eternal terror. They crowded around him, pressing close, their hands dragging at his clothes, his limbs, his very soul. He tried to close his eyes, but it didn't matter. He could still see them in the darkness behind his lids. One face pressed closer than the rest, lips brushing his ear though they were still submerged. A voice rasped inside his head, brittle and hollow, "You shouldn't have come here." The others joined, a chorus of voices not heard with ears but felt inside his skull, layering over each other until they became unbearable. "You're one of us now. You belong to the lake. You can never leave." His chest convulsed, lungs desperate for air, but when he gasped, water flooded him, burning like acid. His limbs grew heavy, his vision blurred, and in that fading moment of panic, Daniel thought he saw his own reflection hovering above the surface, standing on the shore, waving goodbye with a smile too wide to be human. The villagers heard the bellows of wind that night, though there was no storm, no clouds in the sky. They barred the doors and windows, whispering prayers as the howling rose from the lake and spread through the hollow. None of them ventured out, not even when the whispers reached their walls, calling each of them by name. It wasn't until morning that a few dared to return to the shore. They found no body, only Daniel's camera, lying in the dirt where he had dropped it. The lens was cracked, water pooled in its seams, but the memory card was intact. Out of fear and curiosity, one of the younger men removed it, carrying it back into the village with shaking hands. They gathered in the old inn, crowded around a laptop, and when the first images flickered onto the screen, silence fell. The photos showed the lake at night, the firelight reflecting off its surface. Then came the footprints, wet and glistening, circling Daniel's camp. Then the reflection, smiling wider with each frame, closer each time, as though crawling out of the water and toward the camera. And finally, the last photo, Daniel himself, waist deep in the lake, staring into the lens with vacant eyes, while behind him dozens of pale faces reached out from the water, hands resting on his shoulders as though welcoming him home. No one spoke for a long time. One of the elders, a woman whose father had vanished into the lake decades earlier, whispered hoarsely, "The lake has taken him. Just like it takes all who listen too closely." That night, Daniel's voice joined the whispers. The villagers heard it among the others, calling softly from the water's edge, begging, pleading, sometimes laughing, sometimes weeping. They tried to ignore it, but curiosity gnawed at them, the way it always did. One man claimed he saw Daniel standing at the edge of the lake at dawn, dripping wet, smiling faintly. He swore Daniel lifted a hand to wave before vanishing into the mist. Another villager said he saw Daniel's reflection in his window at night, though he hadn't been near the lake in days. Fear spread like wildfire, old superstitions reigniting. They nailed shut the inn's doors, shuttered their windows, and once again forbade outsiders from lingering too close to the water. But the curse had already deepened. Daniel was not gone, he was changed. Beneath the lake, his soul struggled, trapped among the drowned, drifting through the dark currents where time held no meaning. He saw other souls, their forms flickering like shadows, and realized they weren't just trapped, they were feeding the lake, becoming part of it, each whisper strengthening its grip. Sometimes he thought he saw the surface again, thought he could claw his way up, but always hands pulled him down, his voice lost in the endless chorus. Other times, his reflection, his other self, looked down at him from above, smiling, mocking, as though savoring the freedom it had stolen. Daniel began to wonder if he had ever truly existed at all, or if the lake had only ever been waiting for him, shaping his path to bring him home. And above, in the world of the living, the reflection walked free. Villagers whispered of a stranger seen wandering the woods near the lake, someone who looked like Daniel but moved wrong, eyes too dark, smile too sharp. Travelers on the road reported being followed by a man with a camera slung over his shoulder, though when they confronted him, he was gone, leaving only wet footprints behind. The elders shook their heads, muttering that it was the same as before. The lake always sent something back, a lure to draw the next victim. The whispers grew louder with each passing night, not just by the lake but throughout Greymark itself. They seeped into dreams, into thoughts, into the walls of the houses. The villagers began to fear that the curse had worsened, that Daniel's arrival had stirred something ancient into greater hunger. And perhaps they were right, for the lake no longer waited patiently. It called more boldly, its voices reaching farther. Fishermen from neighboring towns vanished. Hikers disappeared on trails miles away. Each time, the whispers grew stronger, and the villagers knew, the drowned were multiplying. At the bottom of the lake, Daniel's last memory of the world above flickered in his mind like a dying ember, his reflection winking at him before the water closed over his head. He hated it, he feared it, but he also envied it, for it was free, walking beneath the sun, while he was nothing more than a whisper in the dark. And slowly, as the days blurred into nights without end, he began to understand the terrible truth whispered by the others: you don't escape the lake. You only change places with the thing that climbs out. The curse lives on. The lake was quiet in the weeks after Daniel's disappearance, but quiet did not mean safe. The villagers moved about with eyes lowered, voices hushed, as though the air itself was listening. Every night the whispers still came, curling through the streets like fog, sometimes faint, sometimes sharp, always familiar. Some nights a woman heard her dead husband calling from the shore. Other nights a child claimed her mother stood at her window, dripping wet, smiling with teeth too white. They all knew the truth: it was not their loved ones, but the lake itself, wearing familiar voices like masks. Yet still, the temptation gnawed at them. To hear a lost voice again, to believe for even a heartbeat that death had not stolen everything. That was how the lake fed. Time blurred, but the curse did not weaken. Travelers continued to vanish, most never seen again, though a few left traces: shoes on the shore, tents abandoned, belongings scattered. Always near the water, always with the sound of voices echoing across the still surface. Some villagers begged the council to burn the woods around the lake, to salt the waters, to do anything to end its reach. But the elders shook their heads. They had tried, generations ago. Fire had been swallowed, salt dissolved, even priests had come to bless the lake, but all had failed. The whispers endured. The curse was not of this world, and no fire could scorch it out. And then came the modern age, and with it, a danger worse than fire, curiosity reborn, magnified through screens and cameras. Stories of Black Hollow Lake began to spread beyond the village, carried not by travelers but by the internet. Posts appeared on forums with titles like, "The Haunted Lake That Drowns You Twice," and "Whispers in the Water, True or Hoax." Photos surfaced, grainy, distorted images of faces in the water, footprints in the mud, sometimes even blurred shapes that looked like Daniel himself. Most laughed it off, but others wanted proof. One of them was Maya Hart, a vlogger from the city who specialized in paranormal explorations. Her channel thrived on abandoned asylums, cursed roads, haunted houses, but views were dropping, and she needed something bigger, something legendary. When a subscriber sent her an article about Daniel's disappearance, complete with the eerie photos pulled from his camera, she knew she had found her next story. She ignored the warnings in the comments, the locals begging outsiders to stay away. Instead, she packed her equipment, rallied 2 friends to join her, and set out for Greymark, convinced she would do what Daniel could not, capture the truth without becoming part of it. The villagers watched them arrive with dread. They recognized the same arrogance, the same disbelief that Daniel had carried. They warned her. An old woman even grabbed Maya's wrist and whispered hoarsely, "The lake never lets you go." But Maya only smiled for the camera and said, "That's exactly what they want us to believe." That night, she set up camp by the lake. Her first livestream drew hundreds of viewers. The water glistened behind her as she told Daniel's story in her practiced, dramatic voice. She showed his photographs, replayed the whispers captured from his recorder. The chat exploded with both awe and mockery. Some begged her to leave. Others demanded proof, real proof. So, as the moon rose high, she turned her camera toward the lake. At first, there was only silence. Then the water stirred. Ripples spread without wind. Viewers typed furiously, "Do you see that? Look behind her. Something's in the water." Maya laughed nervously, brushing it off, but her friends weren't laughing. One of them swore he heard his sister's voice calling his name from across the lake. The other said he saw someone standing on the opposite shore, waving. They argued in hushed tones, but Maya urged them to keep filming. The chat was going wild. Numbers were climbing. This was the moment that could make her channel legendary. Then came the whispers, soft at first, like wind through reeds, but soon louder, layered, unmistakable. Thousands of voices speaking all at once. The livestream captured it perfectly. The audience heard their own names, their own secrets. Panic erupted in the chat. People swore the voices were speaking directly to them, whispering from their own speakers. "This isn't right. End the stream. Stop now." But Maya pressed on, wide-eyed, exhilarated. She leaned closer to the water, microphone tilted, asking, "Who's out there? Daniel, is that you?" The answer came in the ripples. The water darkened, and faces rose to the surface. Pale, twisted, eyes glowing faintly white. They pressed against the boundary between worlds, their mouths moving in soundless screams. The camera caught it all. Maya gasped, stumbling back, but she didn't stop recording. Behind her, her friends screamed, one pointing at his reflection in the water, which now grinned at him while his real face was pale with horror. The other cried that hands were dragging at his legs. The chat became chaos. "Get out. Run. They're coming." But the lake had already chosen. The water erupted, arms surging upward, skeletal and dripping, grabbing at the vloggers. Maya screamed, the camera tumbling from her hands, But the livestream continued as the lens tilted toward the water. Viewers watched, transfixed, as shadows dragged the struggling figures beneath the surface. The last glimpse of Maya was her face, wide with terror, before the water closed over her head. And then the screen filled with ripples, and finally, stillness. The chat went silent. The stream cut off. For days, viewers debated whether it had been staged, a stunt for attention. Some claimed the video vanished from her channel hours later, replaced by a simple black screen that read, "The lake never lets you go." Others swore they still heard whispers through their headphones when they replayed the footage, voices calling them by name. A handful of viewers disappeared soon after, gone without explanation, their last online traces showing frantic posts about dreams of water and faces in the lake. Back in Greymark, the villagers weren't surprised. They buried Maya's camera in the old churchyard, next to Daniel's recorder, next to the belongings of countless others who had fed the lake. And as they covered the grave, the eldest among them whispered, "It grows stronger. Every story told, every ear that listens, it spreads." They were right, because the curse had changed with the times. The lake no longer needed to wait for wanderers to stumble upon it. Through videos, through voices, through screens, it had found new ways to whisper. A viewer in another country could hear its call, just as clearly as if they stood on its shore. Distance no longer mattered. Once you listened too closely, once you believed, even for a moment, the lake had you. It only needed time, and so the legend endures. The drowned still whisper beneath the surface, their voices carried across the world, luring the curious, the desperate, the unbelieving. Some vanish into the water. Some are replaced by smiling reflections that walk among us. And the rest keep watching, keep listening, until the day the lake claims them too. Because the truth is simple, and it has never changed. The lake never lets you go.